We live in a world of incredible change. Many things we thought we could count on, like the definition of words, are now in a state of flux. Is it as chaotic as it seems, or is there actually a kind of logic underneath the chaos that we need to understand if we're ever going to bring things back into order? Joining me now to bring clarity to the confusion is Carl Trueman. He's a professor at Grove City College, a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and the author of The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. In my judgment, one of the most important books written in recent times. He recently published an article in World Magazine called Twisted Self, addressing the same topic. Dr. Trueman, good to see you today.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Well, in the last segment, I think we had a good setup to this conversation because we talked to a pastor who's had his home and family threatened because NBC News discovered their school's beliefs that men can't become women. And this is something that people would have been surprised to find out they didn't believe in recent decades. Now it's a source of outrage to find out that you do believe those things. It feels like the world has gone crazy. How do you think we should view the dramatic changes we've seen in recent years?
Well, I certainly think we should find them disturbing. What we're seeing emerging, I think, particularly in the West and particularly in the United States, I think Europe is starting to pull back a little from the excesses. And what we're seeing emerging at the moment is a very subjectivized notion of what it means to be a human person, what it means to be a human being. And in the long run, I think it is unsustainable to build or maintain a society on the view that's emerging, because you've used the example of transgenderism there, because this highly subjective notion of the self means that we're likely to be living in a time of constant chaos and flux, of constant gotchas, as what you've just described, coming from NBC. And one simply cannot build a coherent view of society or a vision of the future based on that kind of fragmentation.
And Dr. Trueman, let's explore that a bit. What do you see as the competing views of the self in this debate?
Yeah, I mean, one could put it rather simplistically, but I think there's a sense in which I would actually move it away from specific discussion of the self, but think in terms of a broader view of the world as a whole. The big question is, does the world as a whole have a moral shape to it? Does it make a kind of sense on its own terms? Does it represent a sort of external authority to which we need to conform ourselves in order to flourish? Or is it just stuff? Is the world simply a giant piece of, for want of a better term, cosmic Play-Doh over which we can exert our wills, over which we can exercise power, and out of which we ourselves can create meaning? I think that's the fundamental distinction here. And in the case of transgenderism, if you like, does my body have any authority for my identity? Yeah. Or is it simply a piece of stuff that I can use technology to gerrymander into being whatever and whoever I want to be?
Now, I'm a fellow in this Family Research Council's Center for Biblical Worldview. That's where I'm housed within the organization. And as we talk about worldview, we talk about the assumptions that people carry around with them that help them understand the world or not understand the world. And one of those has to do with origin. Is it too simplistic to say that these differences, the way we view the self and ourselves and the universe, is just a function of those who believe that the material world has intentionality and purpose, and those who don't? Is that too simplistic?
No, I think there's a great deal of truth in that. And I think when it comes down to the nature of the human person, we might put it as bluntly as, are human beings made in the image of God, or are they not? Are we simply exalted animals? And therefore, is it legitimate to try to, if you like, transcend ourselves using our technological skills? Or are there limits that are effectively intrinsic to us, or perhaps you might say imposed upon us from without? So I think the way you set up the question is perfectly legitimate.
Therefore, is it actually kind of logical if we assume that the assumptions about reality that secularists have, being my existence is without purpose, it's without meaning, there's not a creator who intended something by the way I was created, if that is true, is it not somewhat logical to conclude, therefore, I can define my own reality because there's no one else to tell me that I'm wrong?
Yeah, and that is, it's sort of the ploy that Nietzsche, the German philosopher, makes in the 19th century. He makes the point that, if God is dead, then we've effectively made ourselves gods. It's for us to create meaning. It's for us to create ourselves at that point. The problem with that, I think, is twofold. One, that imposes a huge burden upon us, and we're seeing the price of that now, particularly in, say, the transgender movement. Imagine the burden placed upon a 3 or 4-year-old who asks their parents, who am I? Am I a boy or a girl? And the parent says, well, you've got to decide that for yourself. That's a terrifying burden to place on a child. And secondly, you can fight nature for a certain amount of time. And with the technological skills we have now, we can fight nature for longer and perhaps more effectively than we were able to do in the past. But sooner or later, nature bites back.
Right.
We're seeing already with the accounts of detransitioners that actually the genital mutilation of the human body does not solve the problem that transgenderism is the presenting effect of. So I think we like to think we're masters of our own destiny, but there's a lot of evidence that points in the other direction.
Yeah. In the specific context of this gender debate, then, if we want to have a solution, and we see this as chaotic, but we want to try to solve this, we want to push back against the darkness a bit, is it then more helpful, rather than having a conversation about whether boys can become girls, to have this conversation about whether there's purpose to our existence and purpose to our lives? And if we can settle that, if we can convince somebody that their life actually has meaning, then the conversation about their sex and whether there's something to learn from their sexual organs, that becomes easier, doesn't it?
I think it does, although the question is that a powerful rhetorical strategy in the world we find ourselves? And I think it is, but it needs to be tweaked somewhat. And what I think we need to do, at least in the short to medium term, is we need to be telling stories. It's one thing to try to argue philosophically about this. It's another thing to be confronted with the story of a detransitioner. Many of your listeners have probably watched the Matt Walsh movie, What is a Woman? The most powerful part of that movie is the testimony of the woman who tried to become a man and now deeply regrets it. Right. I think those of us who are concerned about the transgender issue, as with the abortion debate, we need to make sure that we're telling the most compelling and emotionally powerful stories, because that will get us the platform, if you like, then to talk the philosophy.
Yeah, and you mentioned there the abortion issue, and there is a real connection between the gender issue and the abortion issue, and fundamentally it's found in the slogan "My body, my choice," right? Because we use that in the abortion context, but it really is about much more than that. It's that I'm in control of myself, therefore I can make these decisions for myself. Now, Dr. Trueman, you mentioned these stories about detransitioners and the power that they have, and I agree with you that is the path to winning these. Do you have hope that these stories are now being heard and are influencing the way people see these issues?
I think they are in other countries. I think we've recently had the great news that the Tavistock Clinic in Britain has been closed down. There's a government report that's really pointing to the bogus nature of the pseudoscience that underlies transgenderism. It's been bogus science put in the service of a political ideology, essentially, and that's now being exposed. So I'm encouraged on that front. I think it will come to the United States. What's discouraging about it is, of course, that every detransitioner story is an absolute human tragedy, not only for them, but for their family members. And to get a critical mass of these stories, countless bodies have to be mutilated, countless families have to be destroyed. So I hesitate to say I'm optimistic, because that sounds rather glib. I'm hopeful that the thing will change, but I'm conscious that the tide will only turn on the backs of incredible numbers of individual human tragedies.
And I think from a Christian worldview, that's an important point to make. As you said earlier, nature bites back. And because there are rules that govern us, our attempts to overthrow those rules will only, in the long run, affirm the existence of those rules and the fact that God knew what he was saying in the first place. But the only way to prove that is through lots and lots of pain that people experience. So as believers, our job in speaking the truth is not just to prove that we're right in a debate, but to avoid the tragedy that inevitably results when we embrace lies and live by those. Now, Dr. Trueman, in your article, you talk a lot about the fact that expressive individualism has taken over our cultural mindset. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's a term coined by Robert Bell, I think, in the 1990s, and picked up and used by thinkers today, such as Alistair McIntyre and Charles Taylor. What it really means is that everybody is ultimately defined by an inner core of feelings that they have. And authenticity is found by being able to express those feelings outwardly, by performing those feelings in the public realm, by acting public in accordance with them. It also carries a lot of ethical implications. It tends, for example, to regard everybody else as first and foremost a potential problem, as somebody who can hinder me being authentic, rather than somebody who maybe I'm responsible to or dependent upon. Connects to the abortion debate. Think about, how does the mother having an abortion think of the child in her womb? She thinks of the child in her womb as an adversary, as a problem that's preventing her from really being herself. So expressive individualism, which I think grips the Western mentality, emphasizes autonomy and tends to see all of the human relationships as contractual, not as natural relationships of dependency and obligation.
Perhaps connected to that, and another thing I'd like you to expand on a bit, is your idea of the digital self. And you argue that technology has also had a significant influence on the way we see ourselves. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, well, if at the heart of expressive individualism is the notion that who I am is who I perform myself to be, then technology really puts that on speed. When you think about it, online, I could be talking to you now and pretending to be a guy with a full head of hair and straight white teeth. Self-evidently, I am not that. But technology, social media, allows me to perform in ways and pretend to be things that I'm not in real life. So technology has really generated this, or supercharged this ability for self-creation. And it's also, I think, dramatically attenuated relationships of obligation, dependency, and responsibility. Even today, I was driving to work and I saw a woman walking along the sidewalk with her children, talking on her cell phone. Mm-hmm. And it struck me as interesting. There's this mother with her children, and yet she's more engaged to this person chatting on the cell phone than she is to her own flesh and blood walking at her side. So technology has dramatically changed how we relate to each other, and therefore how we think of ourselves as individual selves.
Well, let's just hope that she was on a quick call with the pediatrician or something.
Yes, I'm being very judgmental, I guess.
No, I understand, though. Your point is well taken. Now, we do try to be solutions-oriented around here. As you observe the world through this understanding of kind of seeing where expressive individualism exists and influences how we think about ourselves, what are the clues that parents and pastors and grandparents and even young adults might look for to see where we have the influence of bad ideas like expressive individualism as opposed to the influence of good ideas?
Yeah, I think it's important to, first of all, to be aware of this phenomenon. Once you become aware of it, you begin to spot it all over the place, and even yourself. So it's important to engage in a degree of self-examination on this. I think when we start to think of ourselves as having rights rather than obligations, when we start to use the first person an awful lot in the way we think about things, when perhaps we spend more time on social media than we do engaging with the real flesh and blood people that we engage with in day-to-day life. Yeah. I think those can be signs that it's beginning to creep into our lives. It's the water we swim in, so it's hard to discern, but being aware of the problem is part of the solution. And then I would suggest very simple things. For example, hospitality. One of the things my wife and I do at Grove City College is we like to open our house to have students around for hospitality, because we want to model to them what real community, not virtual community, but real community, real friendship, real conversations look like. So I would say, well, think small, think local. Think of how you can do this in your own local community.
Well, Dr. Trueman, I have a high school senior who in the next couple of months will likely be touring Grove City College and may at some point be one of those people in your living room. And I would be blessed if that ended up being the future. But before we end our conversation, what's your encouragement to parents and pastors? How can they prevent themselves and the people in their lives from being seduced by these ideas?
Yeah. Well, first of all, be regular in your church attendance. I mean, that's the most basic part of the Christian life. Be sitting under the word regularly. Make yourself accountable to the word of God and to the local church. Secondly, don't get too discouraged. I think we need to realize that cultural change takes a long time. And what we do today, we're not going to see the fruits necessarily by next Wednesday. The thing to do is to be laying a foundation today so that 50, 60, 70 years down the line, somebody has something to build upon. So I think, let's get rid of the short-term mentality. Let's be faithful in the place where God has placed us. Let us do the callings God has given us. Let us love the people God has set before us. And let us trust him to use that in the long term for the transformation of his people.
Yeah. We are often surprised, but God is not. And Dr. Trueman, I'll end with this. One of my favorite sayings: has it ever occurred to you that nothing has ever occurred to God? And I find hope in that in situations like this. The things that trouble us do not trouble him because he's always known everything. Dr. Carl Trueman, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me on.